Hi, this is Jack Stanley, and I wanted to talk about his master's voice recordings, HMV, or the Gramophone Company. I wanted to talk about how it came to be. I'm just going to use a few examples and not go through the whole history, but just use a few fine points and share that with you. Now, the Gramophone Company was founded by Emil Berliner, and of course he got his start in the United States, forming the Berliner Gramophone Company, initially down in Washington, D.C., moved to New York and Philadelphia, and started working with Eldridge Johnson, and produced their records that were pressed by Duranoid in Newark, New Jersey. So it was all over. It was interesting. But by 1898, the industry was doing very, very well in the United States. And Berliner wanted to expand. So he sent some relatives over to Germany, since Berliner was from Germany originally, to build a factory. And also sent a recording engineer by the name of Fred Gaisberg over to start making recordings. He also set up an office there, and the manager was William Barry Owen. William Barry Owen was somewhat of an eccentric individual, but he was one of these individuals who was very, very fast at coming up with ideas. And many times these ideas are brilliant. But as you will see, he really laid an egg with one of his ideas, which we'll talk about shortly. And so we have the new company in 1898, based in London. They set up tents in London where they could press out records, because they didn't have a factory yet. That would be eventually completed, but it'll take a little while. So the company starts, and Owen is in charge. Of course, several things happen. He's as I said, quick-witted, and they start doing a very, very extensive recording campaign with what we call Berliner acid discs, zinc discs, that you would use a fatty substance and an acid to make your recordings. And those were pretty good. You could travel around, make your recordings. And what was really neat about those recordings, if you were traveling and recording an artist, you could play back those zinc recordings within a short time after making them, which will happen later. You'll have the wax, which will cause lots of problems, because if you play back the wax, you destroy the recording. So that's something very, very different. So, Owens, and he's running the office and doing all kinds of stuff. And there was a kind of a interesting fellow who walks in 1899 into the office. And he said he was an artist. His name was Francis Berard. And he had a picture of a little fox terrier looking into an Edison Bell cylinder machine, and wanted to update the picture a little bit, and asked if he could borrow a horn. And one of those amazing moments with Owen, he said, "I'll tell you what, you paint in our latest machine, and I'll buy the painting from you." Of which the artist was very happy to comply. Interesting thing, it made his career for the rest of his life. He just painted copies of the portrait called His Master's Voice. Now, as soon as that gets set up, it's trademarked by Berliner and put aside. Because right now, with the records that were being made, there's something called the Recording Angel. Now, this is not the first label, but I have one of those, but I don't have that with me at the moment. So this is a Berliner gramophone in England. And if you look carefully, you'll see the Recording Angel there. Okay, that was their symbol. This is a 7-inch recording from 1900. And that's important too, because in the summer of 1900, the Berliner Gramophone of Europe purchased the rights to Eldridge Johnson's wax recording process for quite a bit of money. And so, starting in the summer of 1900, they were making wax recording, and the zinc process was dropped. Now, Owen, who was pushing for all different types of interesting things, by the end of 1900, he has a gut feeling. Now, Owen was from Massachusetts. Everybody, it's an interesting thing, everybody in the London office working there, except for a handful, were all from the United States. So the office had a decidedly American accent. And Owen had a feeling. He said, the gramophone disc, it's a wonderful thing, and people are buying it, and people are buying gramophones. But it's a bubble. It's going to burst, and we're going to lose everything. And so he convinces the board to invest in a new type of typewriter called the Lambert typewriter. This was the biggest piece of junk that one could ever imagine. It was a very bad design. It had a dial. You could turn things, hit a couple of keys, and you had to constantly keep doing this stuff. And there's a problem to it, a big problem. And that is, it takes you a month of Sundays to write an article or write a letter. And so they invested, a good deal of the money of the company. And the company changes its name. It is now called the Gramophone and Typewriter Company. This is their new label. Let's see if you can see this. I think you can. If you look carefully, you'll see underneath the recording angel, you'll see the Gramophone and Typewriter Company. This is a late 1901, early 1902 disc. And, of course, they set up all kinds of branches all over the place and, of course, made many, many recordings. But this whole thing with the typewriter would come back to haunt Owen. And eventually he would be removed from the company. It was a terrible mistake, and he was brilliant in so many ways, but this wasn't one of them. And so for a short while, they reverted to a couple of different other labels. And this is kind of a neat one. This is a transition label. If you look here, it's very similar, except it's pink. And underneath the angel, it says, the Gramophone Company. They had dropped the typewriter. And that's a fortunate thing, because the Lambert typewriter was a disaster. And then after they dropped typewriter, they reorganized the company again, reset it up as the Gramophone Company. And also they decided to remove the angel and take on that brilliant idea that had been thought of by Owen, copyrighted by Berliner, and of course by this point used by Eldridge Johnson on his records for what was called the Victor Talking Machine Company. And of course eventually Eldridge Johnson would own a good chunk of the Gramophone Company. He would buy parts of it. This is their label that came out, and of course, there you are. There is Nipper looking into the gramophone. It's a beautiful label. And of course, you'll see the Gramophone Company, his master's voice. Now, interesting thing when you think about it, his master's voice becomes a standard thought, a standard advertising piece. And of course, Nipper looking into that gramophone becomes probably the best known logo of the 20th century. Amazing. Unfortunately for Mr. Owen, it didn't matter too much, and according to Roland Gillette's The Fabulous Phonograph, he was sent back to Martha's Vineyard and he raised chickens. Kind of a sad ending to a pretty brilliant, but not always brilliant individual. He was one of those individuals that had these sparks of brilliance, just like Edward Easton of Columbia. He had these great ideas, and then he would drop things and do crazy stuff as well. It was part of the industry, part of the beginnings of sound recording. But just so you can understand the progression, this isn't all of it. This is just a small little bit of that history, but I wanted to make it easy and digestible. And so, just wanted to share that with you. Hope you enjoyed. Thank you.